Hey everyone, welcome to this explainer. So think of today as your enthusiastic conceptual map for your upcoming textbook chapter. We're definitely not here to just memorize a boring list of dates or names. Nah, we're diving straight into the why behind the history. We really want to build a mental framework that spotlights historical causation, change over time, and the deep, underlying patterns that suddenly make this entire era just make sense. Okay, let's take a quick look at the agenda. We're going to cover the Cold War catalyst, the shift from courts to streets, the limits of legislation, the rise of radicalism, blueprints for liberation, and then wrap up with some key themes to remember. Let's get right to it.
Starting with Section 1, the Cold War catalyst. We've got to ask ourselves a crucial question. Why did the federal government, after literally decades of dragging its feet, suddenly start supporting civil rights in the late 1940s?
Well, think about it. Right after World War II, the U.S. was locked in this intense global standoff with the Soviet Union, right? Both sides are desperately trying to win over all these newly independent nations. But the Soviets had this absolutely devastating propaganda weapon, America's own domestic racism. Just look at this quote from the Soviet newspaper Pravda. The irony was glaring. I mean, how on earth could the U.S. claim to export democracy when it was aggressively denying it to its own citizens at home?
So the whole system of Jim Crow wasn't just a domestic moral failing anymore. It had morphed into a massive national security liability. And this became super embarrassing when African diplomats who were just traveling along Route 40 in Maryland kept getting refused service at whites-only restaurants. It was a complete international PR nightmare. It got so bad that presidents from Truman all the way to Kennedy actually had to step in just to protect America's image abroad.
Moving on to Section 2, from courts to streets. While geopolitics was kind of forcing change from the top down, everyday activists were forcing it from the ground up. But the way they did it fundamentally shifted over time.
At first, civil rights efforts were painstakingly chipping away at segregation through the legal system. Groups like the NAACP were scoring these massive, game-changing victories, like Mendez v. Westminster in '47, and obviously the landmark Brown v. Board of Education in 1954. But here's the catch. Legal victories on paper didn't always translate to real-world change. Frustrated by what was called massive resistance in the South, activists shifted gears. They aggressively moved the battle straight to the streets using nonviolent direct action. You can totally see this explosion of grassroots resistance happen over just a few short years. Rosa Parks refuses to give up her seat, bam, Montgomery bus boycott. Next thing you know, college students are doing sit-ins at segregated lunch counters, and freedom riders are taking integrated buses deep into the South. And these protesters were purposely putting themselves in harm's way, absorbing violent white backlash without fighting back. Why? To capture global media attention, generate some serious creative tension, and basically force a reluctant federal government to step in and actually enforce desegregation. All right, Section 3, the limits of legislation. Now, you might think passing a big law just solves the problem overnight, right? But history shows us it's way more complicated than that. Following intense public pressure and the absolute tragedy of JFK's assassination, President Lyndon B. Johnson pushes through these two incredibly landmark laws. The Civil Rights Act effectively killed legalized Jim Crow in public spaces, and the Voting Rights Act smashed barriers like literacy tests. Don't get me wrong, these are monumental achievements, but as we're going to see, they completely failed to address the deeper, systemic economic miseries, especially for folks living in northern and western cities. Which leads us to the burning question of the mid-1960s. What actually happens when civil rights laws don't fix systemic poverty? Even Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. pointed out that integrating a lunch counter literally meant nothing if a family couldn't even afford to buy a hamburger. Passing a law didn't magically create jobs, fix failing schools, or repair dilapidated housing in urban neighborhoods. Because even way outside the South, in places like LA, Chicago, and Detroit, there were systemic barriers trapping Black communities. We're talking about restrictive covenants, where property deeds legally prevented homes from being sold to minorities. Throw in federal redlining and disappearing factory jobs, and you've got a recipe for starkly segregated, underfunded neighborhoods. That intense economic frustration constantly boiling over with tensions between white police forces and Black communities eventually sparked devastating urban unrest in places like Watts. And that fundamentally shifted the entire focus of the civil rights struggle. This brings us to Section 4. The rise of radicalism. That boiling frustration with poverty, police brutality, and just the agonizingly slow pace of change caused the unified, nonviolent integration movement to splinter apart. It's a really stark contrast when you look at it. Dr. King's early philosophy was all about cross-racial coalition building, integration, and strict nonviolence. But on the flip side, you had Malcolm X. His ideology resonated deeply with a younger generation of activists who were just completely exhausted by white violence and economic despair. They started embracing Black Power, which meant advocating for racial separation, community self-determination, economic independence, and crucially, armed self-defense.
This uncompromising militancy really took center stage by the late 1960s. Groups like the Black Panthers popped up in cities like Oakland, literally patrolling their own neighborhoods with unconcealed weapons to police the police. They were demanding radical economic redistribution and full employment. And, while they ran these vital free breakfast programs for kids, their militant rhetoric and armed presence deeply terrified white mainstream America, which ended up fueling a massive conservative political backlash.
Okay, Section 5, Blueprints for Liberation. What's amazing here is how the civil rights and Black Power movements provided this incredible blueprint for a whole explosion of other liberation movements across the country.
The confrontational style of Black Power, with its heavy emphasis on ethnic pride, combined with the proven organizing tactics of the civil rights movement, it just spread like wildfire. It directly inspired a massive wave of marginalized groups. Suddenly, Mexican Americans are proudly embracing the identity of Chicanos. Asian Americans are organizing for bilingual education. Native Americans are demanding their treaty lands back. And we see the massive eruption of both gay liberation and second-wave feminism.
So whether it was Cesar Chavez organizing the United Farm Workers in the Delano Grape Strike, or Native American activists occupying Alcatraz Island, or patrons finally fighting back against police harassment at the Stonewall Inn, they all recognized this shared fight against systemic domination. They took the hard-won lessons of the 50s and 60s and applied them directly to their own unique struggles for equality.
And finally, Section 6, Key Themes to Remember. Let's quickly wrap this all up by synthesizing exactly what you need to keep in mind for your textbook reading. Definitely use these 5 overarching themes as your mental framework. Number 1, remember, the Cold War made Jim Crow a huge global liability. 2, activists deliberately shifted from courtrooms to lunch counters to force action. 3, sweeping laws like the Civil Rights Act unfortunately didn't erase housing discrimination or poverty. 4, that specific frustration is exactly what fueled Black Power. And 5, this one era triggered a massive domino effect of other liberation movements. Getting a grip on this causation and continuity is going to help you way more than just memorizing a bunch of random dates.
As you dive into the reading, keep this final, provocative thought in mind. How much of the 1960s promise of equality remains unrealized today? History isn't just about the past, guys. It's literally the context for our present. Really consider how the echoes of these exact movements, the ongoing debates over housing, policing, economics, and civil rights, still shape the world we're living in right now. Enjoy the chapter, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.